It will now be my privilege to introduce Ryan Anderson to you. Ryan T. Anderson researches and writes about marriage and religious liberty as a William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He also focuses on justice and moral principles in economic thought, healthcare, and education, and has expertise in bioethics and natural law theory. Ryan Anderson is the editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. Anderson's recent work at the Heritage Foundation focuses on the constitutional questions surrounding same-sex marriage. He is co-author of the acclaimed book, What is Marriage? Man and Woman, A Defense. He has co-authored amicus briefs that have been filed in the Ninth Circuit Court on the case reviewing the constitutionality of California's Proposition 8, and with the First Circuit Court on the challenge of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. And in January 2013, he filed a brief with the U.S. Supreme Court. Ryan Anderson's broadcast and cable appearances include news programs on CNN, Fox News Channel, MSNBC. His work has been featured or published by major magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Examiner, National Review, the Weekly Standard, and Christianity Today. It has also appeared in journals such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, First Things, the Claremont Review of Books, New Atlantis, Touchstone, Books and Culture, The City, and Human Life Review. Anderson received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University. He is a doctoral candidate in political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, where he received his master's degree. Ryan Anderson was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and he currently resides in Washington, D.C. Ryan, we're grateful to have you with us today and look forward to hearing your message.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction. I was thinking about how I was going to modify. I have an outline that I normally speak from when I give talks on college campuses, and I was like, people at BYU-Idaho probably will be more sympathetic to the argument I'm going to make than most of the other schools where I speak. But I decided not to change it. I decided I'll just do kind of the standard argument that I would make if I was at Harvard or Princeton or Stanford, some of the more left-leaning institutions and largely secular institutions. Partly because I hope that this lecture is helpful for when you graduate, when you leave BYU-Idaho, and you engage people who attended those schools. And when they challenge you about what you think about marriage, that you can respond to them and help explain and help them see the truth about marriage. Because what I will argue today is that there is a truth about marriage, and that we can articulate this truth about marriage using the best of human reason and human science. And so what I normally start when I'm at a university, I'll say it's good that we're at a university, unlike a cable news show like CNN, Piers Morgan, because that means we won't engage in name calling. A university is a place for a serious exchange of ideas, a serious exchange of arguments where people on both sides and all sides of controversial questions can make arguments, take criticism, respond to criticism, all with the goal of pursuing the truth. And so universities, at their best, are places where you can explore controversial questions from all perspectives so that you can challenge viewpoints, see how strong they hold up to criticism, so you have a better possibility of discovering what the truth of the matter is. So that's what we'll do today. But there are three things that I won't be talking about. I won't be talking about morality. Some people think same-sex relationships are good. Some people think same-sex relationships are not good. I won't be evaluating them from a moral perspective. I will just be answering the question, are they marital? Is a same-sex relationship a marriage? Second, I won't be arguing from the perspective of religion or theology. There are people who make arguments on both sides of this question from various theological viewpoints. The viewpoint that I take in this talk is from philosophy and social science, not from theology or revealed religion. And then lastly, I won't be talking from the standpoint of tradition. There are some conservatives, Burkeans, who make an argument based on tradition because this is the way things have been, this is the way things ought to be. That's not the argument that I'll make. So what I will do is I'll first start by challenging those who claim to be in favor of marriage equality. Because I think the argument for marriage equality fails, and it fails rather decisively. And it fails because it can't say what marriage is, nor can it explain why the government's in the marriage business. And so we can just explore briefly, before moving into a positive argument for what marriage is, the failures for the marriage equality argument. On the best view of those who defend redefining marriage, what sets marriage apart from other types of human relationships is the degree of intensity. What makes a marriage is that it's your most intense, it's your most important emotional union. And so this is what sets it apart from ordinary friendships or business partnerships or roommate relationships or teammates, classmates. This is the most intense, most important emotional union that you can have. And it seems to me and my co-authors, and I should mention that most of this talk is based on an argument that's developed with a classmate of mine from Princeton, Sharif Girgis, and then with a professor of ours from Princeton, Robert George. So I just want to cite my sources. This is a collaborative project. You only have 1/3 of the What is Marriage team here today. But what we say is when we look at this argument, we say this just collapses the institution of marriage with companionship, broadly speaking. It can't explain any of the 3 traditional norms about marriage in the American legal context: monogamy, sexual exclusivity, or permanency. If marriage is just an intense emotional union, why can't more than people form it? More than 2 people can have an intense romantic relationship, can have an intense emotional connection. There's nothing about emotional union just as such that demands that it only be between 2 people. Likewise, emotions can come and they can go. And so there's no principled reason for why marriage, so understood, should be a permanent relationship. You can have temporary, intense emotional relationships. So why would the presumption be that marriage ought to be a permanent relationship? And then finally, the type of exclusivity that marriage calls for is sexual exclusivity. But some people will argue that their emotional relationships are actually enhanced by having extramarital sexual relationships, having a sexually open relationship. So what is it about marriage that per se requires that vow, that bond be sexually exclusive? Again, we think the marriage revisionists, which is what we term people who want to redefine marriage, can't explain that. And we think that this is for a reason, because I think we argue that once you get rid of the male-female aspect of marriage, you have no longer any principled reason for retaining the number 2, or the pledge of permanency, or the vow of sexual exclusivity. And we'll discuss more of that as we go on. But then lastly, I'll just say, this view of what marriage is can't explain why government's in the marriage business. If marriage is just an intense emotional relationship, why should the state care? We can get the government out of the bedroom. And so it's odd that those who want to redefine marriage want to put the government in more people's bedrooms. If this is what marriage is, why would we have the government recognizing adult, romantic, consenting relationships? It just seems that you could have the government withdraw itself from this. So that's normally the challenge that I would put to students in the audience who disagree with me. I'll say during the Q&A portion, I want you to tell me what you think marriage is. That's the title of the article that we wrote. It's the title of the book that we wrote, What is Marriage? If you want to redefine marriage, tell me what marriage is so that there's a principled ground for the norm of permanency, the norm of sexual exclusivity, and the norm of monogamy. Explain to me why you would deny marriage equality to the same-sex throuple, a throuple being a 3-person couple. And so if you argue that marriage equality demands redefining marriage to include the same-sex couple, why doesn't it demand redefining marriage to include the same-sex throuple or the opposite-sex quartet? That's the challenge. And so we'll have time today for Q&A, so if you do disagree, we can exchange on that. You can tell me what you think marriage is so that the law should recognize couples and only couples, and permanency and not temporary relationships, and exclusive relationships, not open relationships. So if that's the challenge, here's the positive alternative. And I'll sketch out this argument in 2 steps. One, I'll make a more philosophical discussion of marriage, and then 2, I'll do a more policy discussion. And on the philosophical side, we follow Aristotle in saying that you can analyze any type of community by doing a 3-step process of looking at the action that the community engage in, the goods that the community seeks, and then the norms or the commitments that govern that community's internal life. And so to take a non-controversial example, start with a university community. Universities communities are distinctively universities as opposed to other types of institutions by engaging in intellectual action. Your professors give lectures and lead seminars, you take notes, they write journal articles and books, students read journal articles and books, students then write term papers, professors then grade term papers, students will go to office hours, you'll have seminar discussions, you'll do homework. All of these various activities that are distinctive of a university life, that make it a university life, are all oriented towards a common good. So the action are those sorts of intellectual actions. The good is the pursuit of knowledge. What you're trying to do through all those knowledge isn't to just justify whatever perceived conception you have, whatever opinion you might have to have. It's actually to get rid of ignorance and to get rid of mistakes and to get rid of falsely held beliefs and to acquire and appropriate and internalize the truth. So that's the good that a university is seeking. And then there's certain norms or commitments of university life. So in the sciences, it would be something like showing all of your data, not just picking the data that supports your preconceived conclusion, but reporting all of the data, even the data that might call it into question. If you're writing a term paper, it's citing all of your sources, not plagiarizing. All of these norms of intellectual life, of university life, govern the types of actions that we engage in towards the good of discovering knowledge. You can do the same thing for an athletic team. They engage in certain sort of athletic actions with the good of winning a certain sort of competition within norms of sportsmanship and not cheating. That if you're cheating at a game and then you win, it actually takes away the entire point of competing in the first place. You can go through different institutions and analyze it through action, goods, and then norms. So we say, let's turn that analysis and look at the marital relationship. What makes marriage different than a university life and different than a sports team? And what we say what makes marriage distinctive is that it's a comprehensive relationship, and it's comprehensive in just those three respects. It's comprehensive in the types of action that spouses engage in. It's comprehensive in the type of good that the marital relationship is ordered towards. And it's comprehensive in the type of commitment that it demands from the spouses. And so I'll say a word about that. It's comprehensive in the action and that it unites spouses, not just hearts and minds, but also in their bodies. It's comprehensive in the good that's pursued, that it's not just the good of anything in particular, but the good of entire new life, the creation and then the raising of new life. And then it demands a comprehensive commitment of permanency, so you're pledging for the entirety of life, and exclusivity, you're forsaking all others and pledging fidelity to this one person. So let me unpack that a little bit more. This is the most dense part of the lecture. This is the part that you can't do in sound bites on a cable show. But I think this gets to the heart of what makes marriage different than other relationships. All right, so the first, comprehensive action. Ordinary friendships are unions of hearts and minds. Ordinary companionship, these are things that are really just unions of hearts and minds. What makes marriage distinctive is that it unites us at all levels of our personhood. And because we're embodied individuals, to unite comprehensively with another person means that you have to unite at all levels of your being, a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. And so how can two human beings unite at the bodily level? It's not as if I was to stick my finger in someone's ear that we've united. We've touched, we've interlocked, we've rubbed up against it, something like that. But how do we unite? And so the metaphor that we use, the parallel that we use, is what makes one body a single organism? What is it about my body that makes me unified? What is it about my heart, my lungs, my kidney, my liver, my skin, my blood, all these, my muscles, all these various parts of me, is that they're integrated together towards the common good of my sustained life. And we say that with all human aspects, whether it's locomotion, digestion, we're complete as individuals, with the exception of one human function. With one human function, we're radically incomplete. It takes a united pair to perform a single action. That's the function of reproduction. So that a man and a woman, when they unite in a conjugal act, they don't just interlock or rub up against each other or touch each other. They actually form, at a biological level, what the ancient Jewish scriptures refer to as a two-in-one flesh union. They truly become one. And so they unite comprehensively in that it's a union of their hearts and their minds, but also of their bodies. And it's such a strong union that 9 months later, you might have to give it a name. It's not just a mystical or metaphorical union. It really unites them comprehensively. And so that then begins to tell us something about the good that that type of union is intrinsically ordered towards. It's intrinsically ordered so that 9 months later, the action that united a man and a woman as husband and wife makes them a mother and a father. That the lovemaking act is also the life-giving act. And so we argue in the book that this type of action comprehensively unites the spouses, also orients them towards this comprehensive good. It's not the good of discovering the truth about the second treatise of John Locke, which you might engage in at a university. It's not the good of winning the next football game, which might be the good for the football community. It's the good of creating and then raising a new human being. This is a comprehensive good because a new human being is going to experience human goodness in all the various forms in which it comes. So that new human life that you've created, that you're now raising to maturity, will be brought up to experience the good of knowledge, the good of beauty, the good of sports, the good of athleticism, the good of friendship, and then hopefully the good of marriage, him or herself. So you can see how it orients this relationship with a comprehensive pursuit of goodness that's different than what the university pursued. The university pursuit is much more narrow. University is not about creating and then raising new life. University is about knowledge. The football team is not about creating and raising new life. The football team is about winning the game, playing a good game and hopefully outcompeting your opponent. So then lastly, we said that if you engage in comprehensive action towards this comprehensive good, it also demands a comprehensive commitment. And we can now explain why. What sort of comprehensive commitment are we talking about? Exclusivity with respect to sexual union. Because what makes the marital relationship different than those other types of relationships is that it extends a union of hearts and minds into the bodily plane. So if you play football with someone other than your wife, you didn't cheat on her. If you study John Locke with someone other than your wife, you didn't cheat on her. If you unite bodily with someone other than your wife, you did cheat on her. Because it's the sexual domain that distinguishes marriage from those other types of relationships. And this is why we can explain that the type of exclusivity that marriage calls for is sexual exclusivity. Likewise, if you're going to unite comprehensively with someone, it can't be just for a temporary time period. If you're holding something back, saying, yep, I pledge to love you for the next 10 years, but then we're going to reevaluate, you haven't actually united comprehensively. That has to be an open-ended commitment, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, till death do you part. And so we can explain rationally that there's actually a foundation based upon human nature for the traditional marriage vows that many individuals take, and for the way that the law has traditionally regulated the marital relationship. And we also see that this is something that doesn't just take place in the United States. We find this basic view, I mean, we articulate it in an Aristotelian form, but we see this articulated in ancient thinkers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, in Roman thinkers like Cicero. We see this in the Christian tradition with Augustine and Aquinas, Luther and Calvin. We see it in Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant. We see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. What this suggests to us is that this view of marriage isn't unique to the Jews or the Christians or to the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks or to the Enlightenment philosophers or to the Eastern thinkers. It's based on human nature, and that all of these various philosophical and theological and political traditions were all grasping onto the same human truth. And some got it better than others, some got more right than others, some embodied this more completely than others, but that they're all they're all latching onto a truth about human nature. So with that said, you could say, all right, that's all very interesting, that's nice philosophical reflection on human nature. Who cares? Why should we care about this comprehensive relationship in which a man and a woman can unite in this comprehensive way, pursue this comprehensive good, and live out these comprehensive commitments? So let me say a word about why marriage matters from a more policy perspective. If the first set of arguments was kind of the ontological argument of what marriage is, this will be the social function. What does marriage do for a community? And so from this perspective, we argue in the book that marriage exists as a social institution to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife to then be mother and father to any children that their union produces. It's based on the anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on the biological fact that reproduction requires a man and a woman. It's based on the social reality that children deserve a mom and a dad. And that marriage is the institution that cultures throughout time and across the globe came up with and lived out to unite those groups of people, those individuals, into a stable home. Whenever a child is born, a mother will always be close by. That's a fact of biology. The question for culture, and so the question for politics, is will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? And what marriage does is maximize the likelihood that that man commits permanently and exclusively to that woman, and then the two of them take responsibility for raising any children that they produce together. Part of this is also based on the reality there's no such thing as parenting. And I know some of you take classes in parenting. Parenting is an abstract term that describes two different phenomena, mothering and fathering, that men and women interact with children in distinct and complementary ways. So in the book, we quote a Rutgers sociologist, David Popenoe. He writes, quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiating parenting is important for human development, and the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then concludes, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being," end quote. And you can see this just in simple kind of illustrations. If I was to ask you to picture a Saturday morning at home, and one parent is wrestling in the living room floor with their little boys, teaching them to be masculine and aggressive, but not to be violent, teaching them to put people in headlocks, but not to bite or to gouge out eyes or to pull hair. Most people would be picturing the father doing this. It's not that moms can't wrestle on living room floors with their sons, but it's that on average and for the most part, that's something that fathers do. And so it's not surprising that we then see when we look at the social science that boys who grow up without their fathers involved in their life are more likely to commit crime and more likely to spend time in jail. Because one of the things that fathers uniquely do for their sons is teach them how to place their masculine aggression and keep it in check. So how do you be manly and masculine without being violent? And how do you do this without ending up committing crime? What fathers then do for their daughters is that fathers are typically the ones who scare away bad boyfriends and who model what a good, healthy relationship looks like in loving their daughter's mother. So we see that girls who grow up without their fathers involved in their life are more likely to have an out-of-wedlock child. This isn't to say that if you grow up with a single family home that you're doomed for failure or anything like that. It is to say that on average and for the most part, children who grow up with their married mom and dad are given a great blessing in life. They're given a great advantage because both their mom and their dad do unique things for them that children who grow up without those gifts don't experience. And so in that, I normally cite President Obama at this point. President Obama says, "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." This explains why the government's in the marriage business. Not because it cares about my love life or your love life or anyone else's love life, just because of romance. The state's in the marriage business because it wants to make sure that every child, as far as possible, is conceived by a married mom and dad, where that mom and dad will then raise the child to maturity. The state wants to say, how can we non-coercively maximize the likelihood that every child is given the gift of being raised by their married mom and dad? And the way that states do this is by promoting marriage. And so here I'll just mention that promoting marriage doesn't ban anything. One of the most frustrating parts of the marriage discussion that we've been having for the past year is that the media consistently says the state of Utah voted to ban same-sex marriage. The state of Utah did no such thing. In all 50 states, 2 people of the same sex can live with each other and love each other. They can go to a progressive house of worship and have a marriage ceremony. They can work for a liberal business and be given marriage benefits if the house of worship chooses to and if the business chooses to. Nothing is illegal about that. Nothing is banned about that. No one goes to jail for getting same-sex married. What bans look like are when the mayor of New York City wanted to ban large soft drinks. It would have been illegal to try to buy a certain size soda. They weren't going to be sold in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg's idea. That was a ban on something. At some restaurants, you can't smoke inside the restaurant. There's a ban on public smoking. There was no ban on same-sex marriage. The question was the definition of what will the state be recognizing as a marriage and therefore promoting for this public purpose of encouraging men and women to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that kids have their mom and dad raising them. When this doesn't happen, when marriages break down, as they did more or less starting in the 60s through the current day, prior to the 1960s, we saw that it was fewer than 10% of all children were born outside of wedlock. Today, that figure is 40% for all Americans, 50% for Hispanics, and 70% for African Americans are born to single mothers. And the consequences are exactly what President Obama said they are. Higher rates of crime, higher rates of prison, lower rates of graduation. What we saw that crime rose, we saw that social mobility decreased, we saw that poverty increased, we saw that welfare spending took off. This is when the war on poverty took off 50 years ago last week, and it's bankrupting many states and the federal government. So everything you could care about, if you care about the poor and you care about liberty, if you care about social justice and you care about limited government, is better served by a healthy marriage culture than it is by an overweening government that tries to pick up the pieces of broken marriages. And so this is why, from the perspective, I work at a think tank that's on the right politically. We're a conservative think tank. People say, well, why don't you just get the state out of the marriage business? It's that one of the things that limits government is having a healthy civil society. And so one of the things that the state can do to promote a healthy civil society is promoting the truth about marriage in the law. And it does this without coercing anyone or banning any form of consenting adult relationship. So with that, you might say, what are the consequences of redefining marriage? You've talked to us about what marriage is. You've said a little bit about why marriage matters. What's the harm if the state redefines marriage to include same-sex couples? How does allowing Adam and Steve get married impact you or your marriage? These are the sorts of questions that I frequently hear, and I'm sure these are the types of questions that you frequently hear. I'll just mention three things in the remaining time, but all three of them fall under a broader umbrella of law shaping culture, culture shaping beliefs, and then beliefs shaping action. One of the things that the law does is it has a teaching function. There's a pedagogical function to the law. The law teaches certain values. It teaches certain things as being good and true and beautiful, and other things as being bad. Other things as being, this is something you should avoid. This is something that's not beneficial. And so the law will play a teaching role no matter what it does. This is why you can't have morally neutral legislation. Every piece of legislation embodies someone's vision of the good life. Every piece of legislation embodies somebody's vision of justice. So no matter what, we know that law will teach something. And I think redefining marriage to exclude male-female sexual complementarity will have an impact, one, in what the law teaches about the purpose of marriage and how marriage is subsequently lived out. Two, it will undercut those other three norms of marriage. And then three, it'll have direct impacts for religious liberty. So let me say a word about each one of those. First, what we saw after the law redefined marriage the first time with no-fault divorce was that, so I'll put it this way, originally marriage had a presumption of permanency so that you would sue for divorce and you would cite one of the three A's in common law: abuse, abandonment, and adultery. So you had to have a serious reason for going to the court and asking for a divorce. Prior to the introduction of no-fault divorce, divorce rates were in the single digits. After the introduction of no-fault divorce rates skyrocket. They get nearer to 50%, and now they've leveled off. Why? The law now taught something. The law now taught that marriage need not be a permanent relationship, that you need not have a serious reason for calling off your marriage, but that you could get a divorce for any reason or for no reason at all. And as a result, we saw that people started behaving differently because the law shaped culture, culture shaped beliefs, and then these beliefs shaped people's actions. So we think the same thing will happen if you redefine marriage in this way. Because what will the new vision of marriage be? That new vision of marriage won't be that it's about uniting a man and a woman as husband and wife to be mother and father to their children. The new vision of marriage will be marriage is primarily about an intense emotional relationship, and marriage should last as long as the love lasts. Redefining marriage in this way shifts it so it's not so much about the needs of children, a child-oriented institution. It makes it much more about the desires of adults. It makes it much more about adult romance. When President Obama speaks about the importance of fathers, he's exactly right to do so, but then his policies undercut that. Because how will we insist that fathers are essential when the laws redefine marriage to make fathers optional? And that's how the law will shape culture. Redefining marriage to say that two men or two women is the same thing as a man and a woman fundamentally undercuts the public purpose of marriage in attaching fathers to mothers and then that bonded pair to the child. It turns the institution upside down, not as it should be, a comprehensive union that's oriented towards this good with these norms, but a union that's mainly about emotional intensity. Second, there's no reason why the redefinition of marriage would stop here. So I mentioned at the very beginning that the challenge that I would put to audiences is if you think that the male-female aspect of marriage is irrational and arbitrary, explain why we should keep the number two, or explain why the relationship should be permanent, explain why the relationship should be sexually exclusive. And what we've seen since issuing this challenge as kind of like a forward-looking thing is that people are now advocating for all of those subsequent redefinitions, and they've created new words that embody those new definitions. So I mentioned one of them at the beginning, the word throuple. This was introduced to me and my co-authors in New York Magazine. A throuple is a three-person couple. It's not a polygamous relationship, it's a polyamorous relationship. All three people are married to each other. So if you think about a polygamous relationship, it would be man married to this woman, he's also married to that woman, also married to that woman. So it's a series of twosomes with the same man connecting like spokes around a bicycle wheel. With a polyamorous relationship, the group is all married to each other. So it's more like a triangular relationship, all three of the throuple. They live together, they love each other, they share assets together. It can be larger, so they're foursomes, fivesomes. The question is, if marriage is just about an intense emotional relationship, maybe it also includes mutual caregiving, it includes commingling of assets, why can't more than two people do this? And what principle for law and for public policy will exist when the throuple goes to court and says, you're violating my marriage equality? It's not clear what the judge in Utah is going to say at that point. He said that Utah's marriage law is irrational and arbitrary. There's no rational basis to thinking that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. Then why should we keep the number two? What's magical about twosomes? Because the way that we got to the number two in Western law and culture is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the action that creates new life and then provide that new life with one mother and one father. Once you say that's irrational and arbitrary, how do you retain monogamy? The second term, so that's the throuple term. The second term was wed lease. Wed lease was introduced in the summer of 2013, right after the Supreme Court made its ruling, conveniently timed until after they ruled. And the author, it was in the Washington Post, says he's doing a play on words with wedlock. Wedlock connotes something that's permanent and sturdy and stable. Think about everything that you envision when you think of a lock. Wed lease, you can lease a car, you can lease a house. Why not lease a spouse? That's what's being proposed here. And the argument was that the reason that divorce is so traumatic is that we have unrealistic expectations. We think that we can pledge lifelong fidelity. We think that we can make a commitment to another person to love them for the rest of our lives. That's unrealistic, and so we shouldn't aspire to it. It'd be better if we were realistic. We would have a 5-year or a 10-year marriage license, and then if things are going well, it can be renewed, just like you can renew your lease on your apartment or your house or your car. And if things aren't going well, you can just walk away from it. No harm, no foul. We had our 5-year wed lease, and now we're going to see other people. And the idea here that then all of the trauma and all of the social harms of divorce wouldn't follow because it's only about having unrealistic expectations. There was no discussion of children at all in this op-ed. So what happens after your 5-year wed lease for the children that you created together? But again, that's The vision that's on display once you say that marriage is just about the romantic lives of the consenting adults, and it's about their intense emotional union. And then finally, the term monogamish. Monogamish was introduced, if I remember correctly, in 2011 in the New York Times when they were doing a profile of Dan Savage. And Dan Savage is one of the most prominent spokespeople on behalf of redefining marriage to include same-sex couples. And the article was premised on what could straight couples learn from gay couples. And he was saying they could learn the virtue of the monogamish relationship. And what's a monogamish relationship? It's a play on the word monogamous. Monogamous is a two-person relationship that's sexually exclusive. He was saying we should keep the twosome part, but it shouldn't necessarily have to be sexually exclusive. That provided there's no coercion and there's no deceit, you should be free to talk it over with your spouse to have sexual relationships outside of your marital union. And the idea here was that we make unrealistic pledges when we pledge to be sexually faithful to our wife, that maybe we can live out a lifelong relationship, but we can't really expect to only sleep with one person throughout that relationship, and that the relationship might be enhanced if you were allowed to have extramarital outlets. And so that's when the term monogamish was introduced, at least to me and my co-authors. Now, whatever you think about the theology or the morality of polyamory and thruples and temporary marriages and sexually open marriages, think about the public policy consequences. Because from the public policy perspective, the reason the state's in the marriage business in the first place is to try to get men and women to commit permanently and exclusively so that every child that they produce is born inside of the context of a committed, stable relationship that will provide that child with its mother and its father. But for every additional sexual partner I have, whether it's the throuple or the monogamish relationship, and for the shorter-lived those relationships are, the wed lease, the greater the likelihood that I create children with multiple women and that I create fragmented families where my time, my attention, my resources, my love, and my care is divided across those families and across those women. That's why if you have sexually open or group marriage or temporary marriage, it doesn't serve the policy purpose of having the government in the marriage business in the first place. And so again, we can see here that there's a parallel between what marriage is and why marriage matters, and then how redefining marriage undercuts both of those things. So that was the second reason. So the first was that it would immediately transform what marriage is and make it harder to insist that fathers matter. The second was that this is the first starting point in a series of logical steps that would further redefine marriage. That once you say male-female is irrational, arbitrary, everything else goes out the door. Marriage just is whatever consenting adult loving relationship you want it to be once you get rid of the male-female. The third consequence that I'll discuss is the religious liberty consequence. And I think this is going to be a very serious consequence. It already is in many jurisdictions, and I think it will probably get worse before it gets better. What we saw in the state of Massachusetts after its state Supreme Court redefined marriage for that state, and after Illinois created civil unions for same-sex couples, and after Washington, D.C. did the same, was that Christian-run adoption agencies were forced to get out of the foster care and adoption business because they wanted to find the orphans in their care homes with married moms and dads. And the law said, you're now discriminating against gays and lesbians who are married legally in our jurisdiction. You're not treating all married couples in the same way because you're making a distinction between what you think is a marriage and what we, the state, think is a marriage. And it said, unless you're willing to place a child on an equal basis with all married couples, we won't give you the license to run an adoption agency. So it had nothing to do with funding. Some people say, well, you can't take government money and then discriminate. It wasn't about funding, it was about licensing. It's illegal to run an adoption agency without a license. And in all three jurisdictions, it was Catholic Charities, it was an evangelical adoption agency, a Lutheran adoption agency. They said, look, we're not going to stand in the way legally of a gay or a lesbian couple who tries to adopt a child from some other agency. If you as the government say it's legal and if some other agency is willing to perform these adoptions, we won't get in the way. We're just asking you not to coerce us into doing something that violates our conscience. And they argued we have the First Amendment that protects our religious liberty rights to do this, and we have strong social science that shows that children do best with a married mom and a dad, and we'd like to find the ideal for the orphans in our care. That orphans have already suffered one major setback in life, and we want to find them the best family we can, and from our perspective, that's a married mom and a dad. In all three jurisdictions, the state said no. And it said that marriage equality would trump the rights of these individuals. We've now seen in other states where they've combined either the redefinition of marriage or they have SOGI laws. SOGI is an acronym that stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And these are non-discrimination statutes. I think they're coercion statutes, but they're formally titled non-discrimination statutes that elevates sexual orientation and gender identity to the same level as race or sex. And so just as there's certain laws that protect against businesses discriminating on the basis of race or discriminating against sex. Some jurisdictions are now doing this with sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is when we've seen the photographers and the florists and the bakers and the innkeepers who have been fined for not wanting to use their services to celebrate a same-sex relationship as if it's a marriage. So one case, it's Elaine Photography. That's one of the famous cases. Sweet Cakes by Melissa in Oregon's another famous case. In these cases, it's an evangelical family-run business. And they said, we have no problem selling cakes or taking pictures of gays and lesbians. What we don't want to do is to use our God-given talents to celebrate a same-sex relationship as if it's a marriage when we think that that violates God's intentions for marriage. And they said, look, we're not discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. We're not discriminating against gays and lesbians. We'll serve them. But we don't want to be co-opted into celebrating their marriage when we don't think it is a marriage. That we have a conscience. We think the same God who gave us our conscience also gave us our artistic gifts of baking or photography, and we don't want to use those gifts to celebrate something that we think runs contrary to our conscience. So far, they've lost their cases. And so again, what's interesting about this is that you frequently hear libertarians or certain liberals saying, all we want is the right to live and to love how we want to. We're just arguing for marriage freedom. So marriage equality is one of the slogans, marriage freedom is another one. That's not what's really at stake here at all. The coercion works in the exact opposite way than those in favor of marriage equality think. They say, oh, you're banning same-sex marriage. Actually, we're not banning anything. We're not coercing you or your relationship at all. But in you redefining marriage, you are going to coerce us and our institutions because the law is going to say that everyone in this state has to treat the same-sex couple who gets the marriage license as if they're married, even if you and your business and your institution thinks otherwise. So the coercion involved here works in the exact opposite way than it's frequently discussed. So anyway, so that's the broadest case for marriage. It has those three parts of what marriage is, why it matters, consequences of redefining. Since we have a little time left, I just want to mention two of the most frequently asked questions that I'll receive, and I imagine this is true for you, will be, well, what about interracial marriage and what about infertility? And they think that these are like the two gotcha questions that somehow completely destroy this argument, when in fact, like, these are questions that people who are on the pro-marriage side of this debate have been responding to for several decades now. And anyone who writes about this at an academic article or in a book has pages responding to these things, and yet these are the same questions we always get. So I'll take the interracial marriage objection first. So when I was at Princeton in October or November giving this lecture, the first question that was asked, someone raised his hand and says, if you were giving this lecture 40 years ago, you would have said that there was another characteristic of marriage, that it's monogamous, it's exclusive, it's permanent, and it has to be racially pure. So why is it that you're not telling us that what marriage is, it's only, white people have to marry white people, black people have to marry black people? And I looked at him and I was like, thanks for asking that question. Actually, I wouldn't have been saying that. This isn't something that anyone in the broad history of philosophical and theological reflection on marriage has ever said. The bans on interracial dating and interracial marriage are largely a historical abnormality that have nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with racism, which is why you don't see Aristotle or Plato or Augustine and Aquinas and Luther and Calvin and Locke and Kant and Gandhi ever discussing skin color when they discuss marriage. Marriage unites a man and a woman irrespective of their race, because a man and a woman, again, regardless of their race, can unite in the type of action that produces new life, and children need a mom and a dad regardless of their race. So marriage laws have to be colorblind because of what marriage is, but marriage laws can't be gender blind, again, because of what marriage is. Marriage isn't about keeping the races apart, but marriage is about bringing together the two halves of humanity, male and female. So again, you have to understand what marriage is and why it matters to see that race has no bearing on what marriage is, but the sexual difference between a man and a woman goes to the very heart of what marriage is. So the racism objection, also happens to be one of the things that will actually really frustrate people who have been victims of racism when they hear people wanting to redefine marriage say, oh, you're a racist, you're just like the bigots from a generation or two ago if you advocate for marriage, because it's really dissimilar. But I'll attach this to the consequences thing. We did see how did the law treat institutions who were against interracial marriage. If you're familiar with constitutional law history, there's the case of Bob Jones University. It was a school that prohibited interracial dating on campus. They lost their tax-exempt status. And I think rightly so. I think the government does have an interest in stamping out racism. If marriage were to be redefined, and if it was redefined on the argument that those who are opposed to same-sex marriage are no better than and no different than the racists who are opposed to interracial marriage, there would be a precedent for the law then treating those individuals and those institutions in the same way. So you can just see what the stakes are in this debate. All right, so then the second objection was the infertility objection. And here, again, I think that it's a fairly straightforward response. A football team that never wins a football game is still a football team, is the shortest way of thinking about this. So a man and a woman who never conceive a child can still unite in that action. They can form that one flesh union. They can unite comprehensively. Their union won't be perfected because the good that it's oriented towards, the creation of new life, won't take place. And this is why most people recognize infertility as something of a loss. Most people experience their infertility as something tragic because they recognize I'm uniting in this comprehensive way with my spouse, and yet we're not conceiving. And so many couples will adopt, they'll try to rectify this in other ways, but they're still uniting in this comprehensive way, such that is radically different than a man and a man or a woman and a woman. Secondly, their relationship takes nothing away from the public purpose or meaning of marriage. So if a man and a woman are married and they're infertile, it doesn't send a signal that marriage isn't about mothers and fathers. It doesn't say at all that two men or two women are the same thing as a married mom and dad. So from the public policy perspective, nothing is taken away from this. And the last thing I'll mention is it could actually, and in many cases does, still serve that public policy purpose. Normally, infertility is only experienced by one partner of a marriage. It's very rare when both spouses are infertile. And if you just take the case of menopause, so elderly people getting married, men are fertile more or less until the day they die. Male fertility is a remarkable thing. So in the marital relationship, keeping them faithful to each other, you are preventing one or the other members of that marriage from creating fragmented families. So if I'm a 50-year-old man and I marry a 50-year-old woman, we're past the age of childbearing years, but if I'm faithful to my wife and I'm not cheating on her with my secretary, I'm still advancing the public policy goal of marriage, which is to prevent the creation of fatherless children and fragmented families. So again, it doesn't in any way take away from marriage. It's still forming a comprehensive union, so it's still a true marriage. And this is one reason why there's never been a fertility requirement for marriage. If you look in the civil law, if you look in the common law of England, and you look in the canon law of many churches, infertility was never grounds for an annulment, whereas impotency was. And so what's the difference? With impotency, you never actually united comprehensively. For the impotent couple, they never transform their union of hearts and minds into the bodily dimension. They never make it a comprehensive union. The infertile couple does. They truly unite, and then it's a tragic lack for many of them that 9 months later, it doesn't result in the crowning perfection of the union. So anyway, so that's the broad point of the infertility objection. I don't know if we want to do questions now or if we're going to take a break, because I know there.
Let's do a little bit of a break.
Sure. So we'll take a break because I think there are classes at 3, and then at a little after 3, we'll start up again with Q&A.
Let's